another special edition of AML Conversations. I'm your host, John Byrne with AML RightSource. And with me today, again, because she's been kind enough to be part of several podcasts we've done in the past, is Ashleigh Subramanian Montgomery from the Charity and Security Network. And what we've asked Ashleigh to talk about today is a very timely issue. We've mentioned many, many times the challenges that humanitarian and charitable groups have had in getting financial access, either getting financial accounts, keeping financial accounts, addressing issues where charities are working in conflict zones and other areas where it's critical that funding gets there to deal with issues of medical supplies and water, utilities, you name it. And so, Ashleigh, I'll start it off this way. As we know, the Financial Action Task Force, which the U.S. helped create back in 1989 and is now the subject of a mutual evaluation, which briefly, and I think most of our listeners understand the process, but briefly is the evaluators come from other different countries. There's a select group of 6 or 7 evaluators, give or take. And what they do is they have both on-site and other meetings with stakeholders in a particular jurisdiction, and they try to determine whether the money laundering and sanctions and financial crime laws are being handled effectively. What's the effectiveness of those laws in a particular jurisdiction? They go back after the meetings and write a report. That report takes a couple of months. Once that report is highlighted at a FATF plenary meeting, that gets posted and publicized, and it does impact and has impacted how jurisdictions react to some of the findings. So if a finding says there's concerns about certain laws or regulations, those might get changed. If they get a report that says they're actually compliant with all these laws and regulations, they sort of continue on their way. So the U.S. is going through that process now. In the past, the U.S. has been criticized in part in the space regarding beneficial ownership. And so that's a separate issue of what we're going to talk about today. But what happened because of that criticism, laws and regulations were changed to make them compliant with what FATF considered to be a really important area of focus. And again, we're not having that conversation today, but others will tell you that the U.S. has kind of stepped back a little bit there. But we're totally focused today only on how FATF is going to look at the U.S. regarding how they handle financial access and related topics. So with my long-winded introduction, I want to say that you folks wrote an excellent, what you call a shadow report back in December, and this will be available in the show notes. And this is a submission to the FATF oversight group, the evaluators, regarding the evaluation. And so let me just end there and open it up for you to talk a bit about what was the goal of what you did. And then we'll talk about maybe since then, what have been some things that you want to add to that. But the report is a 40-page report. Excellent. It's very highly footnoted, and you guys go into tremendous detail. So talk to us about the process that led to the report and what are some of the initial findings, and then we'll see where you are today.
Okay, thanks so much, John. It's always great to be here with you. We built out an NPO or nonprofit organization shadow report in the lead up to this moment with the U.S. FATF Mutual Evaluation being underway, as you said, that we published in December 2024. 2025, excuse me. One of the reasons that we did this is kind of looking back at the US's last mutual evaluation, which took place in 2016. The Charity and Security Network also developed a shadow report in the lead up to that evaluation. So what we wanted to do is a stock take of US government actions pertaining to AML CFT and impacts on the nonprofit sector between the last evaluation in 2016 and today. Noting, of course, FATF has changed the methodology, so now it's every 6 years that a country's evaluated, but we still wanted to do a holistic and comprehensive stock take. And just as a reminder for listeners, in 2016, the US was rated largely compliant on recommendation 8. So our goal, as I said, was really to document government actions between 2016 and 2026 in relation to how they impact nonprofits. we really strove in the research and writing, and then we conducted surveys with both the nonprofit sector and then with financial institutions and donors to be as balanced as possible in showing both the positive U.S. government actions and giving credence and credibility and credit where credit's due, while also highlighting the negative executive actions, legislation, proposed legislation, and different things that have had a negative impact on the nonprofit sector. So that was kind of the process and the lead up and thinking behind the report and lead up to the report. And then some of the key findings or overall takeaways from the report is that there were a number of positive government actions that we could point to, like the U.S.'s involvement and co-leadership in Security Council Resolution 2664 and 2761. That, of course, created the humanitarian carve-out across asset freeze measures of UN sanctions regimes. The new and amended baseline general licenses that Treasury then authorized and published soon after the 2664 resolution, which created the U.S.'s domestic implementation of that resolution. The AML Act of 2020, having the first time Congress really showed an emphasis on de-risking and mandated the Treasury's de-risking strategy and these types of actions. So we tried to spotlight those. At the same time, there's unfortunately been, recommendation 8 calls for governments to take a risk-based approach, meaning they're only looking at those NPOs that represent the highest risk and identifying the terrorist financing risks for those NPOs versus applying the same measures to the whole sector. Is supposed to be targeted, proportionate, and risk-based. And we found, and not unduly, how recommendation 8 is implemented, how governments implement their domestic AML CFT regulations, and how they implement the FATF standards domestically is not supposed to unduly disrupt the NPO sector. And we unfortunately found that a lot of the government actions, particularly under the current administration, do cause this undue disruption.
A couple things. One is, as you know, because you guys were the leaders in this space, that the private sector has worked with you since 2016 because in part because there was confusion within the financial sector regarding how to navigate the fact that there have been charities that have been inadvertently utilized to move illicit funds, but also there's so many charities in which with their due diligence, that's not remotely an issue. So working with the regulators, working with other stakeholders, as you well know, the industry tried to say, give us some more direction so that we can work with our partners in the charity sector. And several documents were created and have been created, are still live documents, basically, that do say things like, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, that not all charities are the same, that as long as you understand their due diligence and there's more coordination, that, you can obviously bank and handle these institutions. So all of that has occurred. And then you're right. Certainly when this administration came in, a number of these executive orders gave all these financial institutions more than pause because they were under the belief things are getting clearer. We believe that if we can make a business decision to bank humanitarian groups for a variety of reasons, we can do that. The risk-based approach should allow us to handle various risks because there are different levels, but some of that got turned around. And I think that's part, you tell me, that's part of your community's concern because these executive orders, which don't have the force of law, but obviously the regulators see them. And so the financial sector is trying to figure out, how do we navigate this now? There's been a whole host of them. So why don't you talk a little bit about that as well? Because again, we were on the road to, I won't say success, but definitely improvement. And this sort of stymied that. I know you feel that more than we do, but I do recognize that that's a major concern.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the joint fact sheet that regulators put out on NPOs, the changing, it took 5 years after recommendation 8 was first changed in 2016 for the US to catch up and change the bank exam manual chapter on NPOs in 2021 to mirror FATF's language that NPOs are no longer considered particularly vulnerable to terrorist financing. I don't think that that characterization was actually ever evidence-based, but as you say, we were on the right track.
Right.
So some of sadly, the government actions that we have seen, and as you say, John, they're really making financial institutions and banks more hesitant, more scared, more willing to pull back. Not just financial institutions, also donors, more hesitant to fund certain types of programs or activities or programs in certain jurisdictions as well. So National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, and then the accompanying leaked memo that came out in December of last year that highlighted how NSPM 7 should be implemented. I think that has caused big concern across the nonprofit sector for how it could be used, and it's kind of directed to be used to directly target nonprofits that the U.S. deems as political opponents or doesn't like under the guise of terrorist financing. They haven't yet released the SARS or Suspicious Activities Report guidance that's mandated under NSPM 7, but there's concerns around what that could look like and what that could mean for the relationship between financial institutions and nonprofits. There's the executive order on Antifa. There's the proposed legislation that's come up a few different times, like HR 9495, that targets nonprofit tax exempt status, and then proliferation of foreign terrorist organization designations, concerns around who's going to be deemed as a domestic terrorist under this administration, despite there being no legal authority to actually make that designation, still concerns. And just part of the concern throughout the nonprofit sector, in addition to many of these executive actions directly naming nonprofits and saying that there'll be investigations and these types of things, is also just how wide the tent is that this administration is using for domestic terrorism. So essentially, as I said, anyone that they don't like, that has a woke gender ideology, these really anti-American, anti-fascist, all of these things, were essentially, it's so wide that almost any nonprofit could be accused of supporting terrorist financing under this.
So a couple things. One, as you completed the report, you talked about some of the positives. Like you said, the fact sheet that came out, it did take a while, but it was out. It was sort of becoming more ingrained in the industry. Then these executive orders turned things a bit backwards, to say the least. But since the reports was finalized in December, your goal was twofold, right? Your goal was to get that information in front of evaluators so they could see some of the intended or unintended impacts of all these things. That was goal number one. And goal number two was to let the broader community understand why you still have concerns, that it hasn't been solved. So that gets filed in December. So now we go to 2026. And just recently, the Treasury Department released several risk assessments, the money laundering risk assessment, the terrorist financing risk assessment, and the proliferation finance risk assessment. And obviously their timing was to get those assessments out while the evaluators are in the U.S. and having their meetings with stakeholders. Did any of those reports give you, comfort's the wrong word, but lack of another word, but give you a sense that some of the things, either from the executive order or some of the things that occurred in 2025, that the reports reference to the NPO community might be back on the road to improvement? Just give us both sort of from a policy perspective and then from a practical operational perspective.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So the National Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment that came out, as you noted, very recently, it does have very strong and good language regarding the NPO sector, both this one from 2026, but the one from 2024, and even some past ones before then. I think the first one was 2015. has had good language where Treasury is stating that the majority of US-based NPOs are at little to no risk of terrorist financing. So that's, from a policy perspective, that's hugely valuable. It's something that we certainly lean on in our engagement with FATF, with banks, with kind of a whole host of different advocacy targets or folks that we engage to just remind them that this is coming, from the US Department of Treasury themselves. Right. So I think that's been really, it's valuable from the policy perspective to lean on. But you also asked about the practical. I will say we don't always see it trickling down in practice, sadly. So kind of going back a little bit to the report, which I urge everyone to read and take a close look at the surveys. From the NPO surveys, 75% of the NPO surveyed said that they experienced delayed or rejected wire transfers since the 2016 FATF Mutual Evaluation. So just to kind of concretize that in practice, we still don't see this fully trickling down at the implementation level, sadly. But it is helpful to have a tool like this, a narrative like this, policy perspective like this, to be able to lean on and push forward. I will say that, the kind of beginning point of recommendation 8 is conducting a sectoral risk assessment of the NPO sector. The US doesn't do a standalone risk assessment. It's the NPO risk assessment as part of the National Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment. I wouldn't necessarily call it a true consultative risk assessment process. We had one meeting between the NPOs and the Treasury Department when it was clear they'd already written the NPO section, and it was more them kind of presenting to us the findings versus us being able to feed into the process. Again, it was good language, but I think where we could benefit from it being a more consultative process is it's still unclear how the US government is separating out truly high-risk NPOs in the US context versus the full gamut of the NPO sector, which, again, recommendation 8 and the risk-based approach calls for.
Yeah, I pulled up the report, and just to repeat what you've said, and I think this is what you try to get in front of the financial community, but probably more importantly, the regulatory community as they examine the banks, because that's the issue, right? That's how it. Exactly. But it does say charitable NPOs play a vital role in delivering humanitarian assistance to vulnerable populations throughout the world. Millions of people residing in crisis or conflict zones rely on the work of charitable NPOs. And in the past, certain types have been vulnerable to abuse by terrorist groups, so they leave that there. However, in the last decade, the sector has made strides in addressing and mitigating the threat posed by terrorist financing, including increasing due diligence measures and risk mitigation efforts, often in collaboration with Treasury and the broader U.S. government, and I would say with the financial sector itself. It's hard to quibble with that language, but as we both know, one of the major reasons why the financial sector reacted the way it did to charities in the past couple of decades was after 9/11, it was considered every charity was problematic. Now, again, I'm overstating it a little bit, but not that much. And so it took a long period of time under different administrations to get them to language like this. So you're right, language is great, but we need to translate that into how is the FDIC or the Fed or the OCC going to examine a financial institution, either a traditional one or a fintech, to make sure that if they're banking charities, that they are handling the risk, it's a risk-based approach, and that they can document why they're doing it, not getting, quote, second-guessed about it. That's the issue. That's the practical side of this, right?
Exactly. And I will say, John, you make a good point of other good language within the National Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment. And that's just that NPOs really share in the goal that financial institutions, FATF, Treasury has of aid ending up in the hands of their intended beneficiaries. They want the transactions to go where they're meant to go. They want the aid to go where they're meant to go. They probably have the most to lose if it doesn't. So the sector does have really stringent and sophisticated self-regulatory measures to ensure that aid and transactions end up where they're supposed to. Very strong due diligence, very strong risk mitigation, and bigger NPOs who really can afford these types of compliance staff try to support smaller NPOs that may not have the same level of resourcing and staffing as well. So there's a sort of cross-sectoral trying to support one another, no matter what type of NPO you are.
What are some of the other parts of the report that are, I don't want to say are still valid, but still current? Because we have these documents come out since, and and obviously we'll talk about a December memo that I know I want to ask you about. But what are some of the other aspects of the report that are still want to get in front of the evaluators and in front of the community that we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. So a few things. I mean, given the amount of political targeting that has come out against the NPO sector, particularly over and throughout 2025 and to the present, and the weaponization of a lot of US CFT measures within this targeting, we did come to our ultimate conclusion was that the US should be rated as partially compliant on recommendation 8. So that's something that we hope that the assessors take into account and keep in mind, and know that we came to this assessment and recommendation in a very data-driven, evidence-based way.
Let me ask you a quick about that. So do you think you would have come to the same conclusion if this report was written in 2024? Meaning that if these executive orders hadn't clearly muddied the waters. Now, I know you'd have to do an analysis and data, like you mentioned, but just in general, do you think you might have come up with a different recommendation, or it was still an issue where even though we were on the road to success, more had to be done? It might be an unfair question, but I thought, just given what's happened in the past 15 months or whatever it's been, I just wonder if your conclusion would have been the same.
That's a really good question. As you said, we definitely would, try to do a true assessment and look at the evidence and
Sure.
evaluate everything before drawing a conclusion. But my hunch is that because as you noted at the beginning, things weren't perfect. There's still a lot to be desired, a lot to be worked on. But because there was progress and we seem to be on the right track, I actually do think we likely would have recommended largely compliant for the US if the context was not what it is today.
Yeah, I think that's more than fair. All right, so we did say we wanted to mention something else. I've only seen this reported by CBS News late last week. We had a conference that we were at that had representatives of various agencies. It's not open to the press. There was a lot of discussion about various financial crime related issues that came out then, but we didn't really have the ability to ask any of the representatives there. The headline this is from March 18th, the FBI and the IRS to investigate nonprofit groups for domestic terrorism link, it says, sources say. The storyline is that CBS News was briefed on this. Like I said, I haven't seen this anywhere else, but it goes into, back in December, the Attorney General ordered law enforcement agencies and federal prosecutors to prioritize efforts to investigate and prosecute groups and individuals who belong to the anti-fascist Antifa movement or are deemed extremist. And then the quote is from the memo, I'm quoting here, these domestic terrorists use violence or the threat of violence to advance political and social agendas, including opposition to law and immigration enforcement, extreme views in favor of mass migration, and open borders, adherence to radical gender ideology, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, or anti-Christianity, unquote. A lot to unpack there. And so, according to the story, the FBI declined to comment. Justice Department said they're committed to the rule of law, something like that. And the IRS says they're working with the FBI and DOJ. What concerns you about this announcement, which again, we've not seen amplified anywhere else, but it is there, and certainly it was based on a briefing done with DOJ had with CBS News?
Yeah, thanks for this question, John. A few different things concern me about this. I think number one is kind of the lack of clarity and understanding around where is this coming from? Is this an actual tie to, as you said, the leaked bond memo from December. Is this supposed to be implementation of NSPM 7 and a step in that direction? It's really unclear if it's part of that or if it's a separate initiative. So that lack of clarity and trying to understand exactly where this is coming from to then know how to best approach it, I think is a big concern. I also, like you, haven't seen it reported anywhere else. And in talking with colleagues who, like you and I, track these things pretty closely, there's just nobody really seems to know much further information about this. And obviously, information is power, and knowing why or how or where things are coming from is useful. So that's a concern. A second concern is just kind of what we talked about before, that when we see executive actions or whatever this one is from the administration using domestic terrorism, it's such a wide tent. And a lot of the things you noted, that this kind of extremist ideas on immigration or gender, or I think the phrasing is obviously intentional and politicized and weaponized. But if you were to pick a lot of those apart, I think what a lot of nonprofit organizations and a lot of just citizens of the US actually want is just basic human rights for a wide amount of groups and people and folks and communities that are targeted. And that's, in my opinion, not at all radical. That's just kind of a basic right that everybody should have. And then the final concern is just that, the FATF assessors are here now, and we can submit information to them about government actions through the end of this month. But after that, they really can't take on new information that would go into the U.S. Mutual Evaluation report that they'll develop. So there are concerns that is the government, releasing some things, but really holding back. And on April 1st, they'll do a flurry of executive actions, knowing that it can't really impact the outcome of the mutual evaluation.
Let's get you out of here on this with a couple things. One is I urge folks to subscribe to your newsletter. The Charity and Security Network newsletter comes out on a regular basis and contains obviously a lot of different source material on what's happening, and reports and guidance, opinion pages, all sorts of things. And that is essential for those in the financial space, that this is a part of your risk assessment process, is dealing with different types of entities, and what are some of the things you can learn from groups like Ashleigh's group. But the second part, Ashleigh, I guess a broader question for you and for your colleagues. This report will get crafted over the summer, but after the evaluators have left, what would be your charge to the financial sector now? Once the policy advocacy part is gone, what should they better appreciate from your world, from the humanitarian world, besides what we've already talked about? Conversation, communication, make sure you understand the due diligence that the charity's doing, the due diligence the bank is doing. What other words do you have to our colleagues in the AML community going forward? Because this is going to be a constant, I won't say challenge, but it's going to be a constant area that could be an area of focus, certainly with this administration. And we want the banks to be able to handle this from a due diligence perspective. That's what they do. They handle risk. They do credit risk. They do lending risk. They do regulatory risk. That's the business that they're in. So give us some, I'll say, words of wisdom. What can we be doing going forward?
Yeah, I think this one always sounds obvious, but it's really, really true. I can't, overstate it enough, that communication really between AML-CF experts like yourself, John, and the nonprofit sector, communication between financial institutions and the nonprofit sector. I know that there's limitations in what banks can share, but as much transparency and openness from the banking side. I know NPOs also share in that goal. We want to be transparent and open. So if there is a financial transaction that gets stuck somewhere, how can we work together to get it resolved quickly? Maybe also for financial institutions, just noting that I know and respect in their internal policies and priorities. At the same time, for the nonprofit sector, especially for organizations working in areas of great humanitarian need or where there's peace building efforts, a delayed transaction or denied transaction can quite literally be the difference between life and death in a community. So just keeping in mind that policies and words on a page have real life impact in the real world.
I'll close it down this way in terms of FATF specifically. It was heartening to see the president of FATF from Mexico, and her term is over, but she focused on financial access. So a lot of the speeches and the comments. Mm-hmm. So obviously FATF itself, through her leadership, understands what you folks are dealing with on a regular basis. So folks should look to FATF guidance, documents, speeches, and those sorts of things. And then, as I say, get better engaged with the charity folks and some of your advocacy groups, because you do provide excellent insight. So thank you for doing this. Good luck. We're going to have follow-up conversations with you or your colleagues. I know that's going to be the case. And maybe we can I'll put this out now. When the plenary posts the U.S. report, we're going to do a webinar on it here at RightSource. We'd love to have you guys on the panel. We can talk about whatever is in that report and what's both the practical as well as the policy implications. So that's something we'll get on your calendar later in the fall. So Ashleigh, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, John.